Friends, colleagues, students, visitors, you're all very welcome to this special lecture by João Nunes, The Design of the World. A very small thing to be talking about, but we'll have a go. I'm Ginny Lee, and I'm the Elizabeth Murdoch Chair of Landscape Architecture, and I'm also Associate Dean of Engagement at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, University of Melbourne, and also part of the Melbourne School of Design. I'd like to begin proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri people, and pay respects to their elders and families past and present. Unfortunately, Professor Tom Cavan, this is his Dean's Lecture Series, but he can't be here tonight. So it's great pleasure for me to be part of this special series of events and to introduce you to renowned landscape architect João Nunes. This is the fourth and final lecture in the Dean's Lecture Series for 2013. Through the Dean's Lecture Series, we aim to present a breadth of expertise across the faculty's discipline areas, with international experts across areas such as architecture, urban development, planning, construction, policy, and today, landscape architecture. We've clearly seen through our Dean's lectures over the years just how many disciplines impact the built environment and how they clearly intersect to create the world in which we live. This interrelated way of working is central to the curriculum of the Melbourne School of Design because it mirrors the way built professionals work in real-time situations. So we trust that the Dean's Lecture Series provides you with an opportunity to better understand the built environment and its interrelated disciplines on an international scale. So it's fantastic to be joined by João Nunes, Portuguese landscape architect and founder and CEO of landscape architecture studio ProApp. We first met a couple of years ago around a glass of wine and a conference in Copenhagen, and at that stage we talked about the world of landscape architecture both in terms of teaching and research but actually also practice. And it's from that day that now João's here a number of years later, so we're very pleased that he could come. A little bit about ProApp. After a 5-year collaboration with friends and colleagues, João met while studying at university. Now note that, students, while studying at university, João's practice started. The ProApp studio was born in its present form in 1995, and it gathers professionals in a cross-disciplinary team including landscape architects, urban designers and environmental professionals. The practice is centred in landscape, with its work and research demonstrated in landscape interventions based upon the interpretation of places and the various ecological and social systems that define them over time. As International Director, João is responsible for the strategic, executive and tactical leadership of the 4 international offices, Lisbon in Portugal, Luanda in Angola, Treviso in Italy and Shanghai. Over the past 20 years, the team at ProApp has been dedicated to investigating ways to understand and communicate with landscape through national and international projects, including their first large competition success in 2000, Park Forlanini in Milan, which João credits as enabling the practice to gain both international and local attention and subsequently leading to the expansion of the practice over the following years. So note, students, competitions are good. João has taken his industry experience to students across international campuses. He has lectured at the Instituto Superior de Agronomia in Lisbon, sorry if I got that wrong, since 1991, and also lectures at a range of European universities across Italy, France and Switzerland, and also at Harvard. As we spoke earlier today, I was made aware of his guiding inspirations, which he notes in no particular order, and I'm sure he doesn't mind sharing with you. Firstly, food. As a social event that allows for the celebration of the places from which the meal is imagined and constructed. And he has run a very successful restaurant, as I was hearing today. Music. He plays both the classical guitar and jazz saxophone, for any saxophonists here. Teaching and the absolute need to engage with students as a practice of experimentation and renewal. Children. as a catalyst on how to think landscape towards being mindful about what is being given to them through the works of Landscapes for the Future. He speaks of the idea of generational transmission, the legacy of memory and an ethical way of looking at and acting with landscape, and not to forget his two fabulous dogs. So this evening, João will consider the interconnected concepts of time and landscape, and these concepts have changed in the last few decades, and with it the attitudes of people towards the world and its transformation. ProUp is a studio that was born precisely at the inception of a changing perspective towards landscape design. To talk about landscape means to talk fundamentally about the inscription of signs that are made visible through the manifestation of people's lives, communities, villages and countries. This inscription is mainly tangible, made physically in the world. It forms a mark, a groove, and several meanings can be extracted from that mark. Time is an element which informs our projects and is simultaneously constructive and descriptive of our work. They're ProUp's words. So a selection of projects developed by ProUp during the last years is now presented as an example of the main conceptual principles. Please now join me in welcoming João Nunes to the stage.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this honor to be here and to present the Dean's lecture. Thank you, Jenny Lee, for this incredible invitation. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to the Honorary Consul of Portugal to be here today. I know that the title seems a little bit pretentious, but what we really mean is that when we go through landscape, we have to talk about these values. First of all, the idea about the thickness of time, because we actually struggle to point out some points of view about what landscape really is. And we move in very narrow paths between a very consistent culture about architecture and the need to understand that landscape is made from natural and cultural processes mixed together. So, talking about landscape, first of all, to try to understand what landscape really means and trying to understand it in order to understand the project that following I will try to explain. And talking about the three values that I consider fundamental to explain landscape. Well, the first thing about landscape that I think is important to state out is that it is a word that is, I mean, everybody says the word, but nobody says exactly what it means. To illustrate this, there is a fantastic book from an Italian architect, which is called 48 Definitions of Landscape. If a word that has 48 definitions is no longer a word, I mean, it's useless. So we really need to get straight on a definition that to us, we are landscape architects, so we work with landscape. We need a definition that enable us to understand how to be operational with it. So we don't need just a set of phrases to enframe and put on the wall. We really need a concept explanation that we can use in our practice. This idea is an idea that, first of all, is based on dynamics, the idea of dynamics, the idea that, that landscape is a process. Landscape is something that is continuously changing with very different rhythms. And looking at Europe, we have the sensation that these rhythms are pretty much the same, because we are touching practically only cultural landscape, because we don't have the possibility of measuring directly the time and the thickness of time of the natural landscape rhythms. But coming here, we understand how different they are, and how we have landscapes that move with very intense rhythms of change, and others that have other different rhythms. But I think that practically we can describe them in terms of structure pretty much of the same way. This is a palimpsest. And palimpsest is a word that comes from the Greek and means rewriting, writing again, writing on new. And it means literally that the Greeks used to erase parchment to rewrite things. Obviously, they had more ideas than they had parchment, so they had to, with a soap made with lanolin, the grease of the sheep wool, and using stones, they erased the parchment. Well, this idea of palimpsest was used by art historians to describe the process in which painters used to paint over their paintings because they could not afford to buy new canvas. So we discover often layers and layers of different paintings overlapping in the same canvas. And urbanism took this idea to illustrate with the same word a process where cities and structures of urban structures are practically rewritten, totally destroyed to be again imposed to the surface. This is an idea that comes from the Italian school of urbanism, and that has pretty much to do with the idea of tabula rasa, the idea of the possibility of erasing to rewriting. But the interesting thing that really has to do with landscape is that, as you can see, not even the Greeks were able to erase completely the old writings on the parchment. So actually, rewriting becomes an action of combining what we are writing today with what was actually written yesterday. And the result, and I like this example very much because this is called the Archimedes parchment, Archimedes palimpsest. And it's a liturgic text that was written upon a text by Archimedes about the sphere and the cylinder. And obviously, the only way that they had to be able to read clearly the new words that were being written was to rotate and to create an orthogonal relation with what was written before. So I think that in landscape, this idea of palimpsest has to do precisely with a vertical construction along time of connections and contacts and relations between what we do today and what we did yesterday. So much more than a construction made in space, which it obviously is, because the marks that we enhance, the signs that we imprint, the processes that are imprinting signs in the territory, they have a special manifestation and they cover the world in every moment. But of course, by this process, we can recognize also that there is a temporal writing. So it is a building made out with space and time. So these images, they illustrate all these kind of rewriting processes where the relation with the old writings, with the old urgencies, with the old emergencies that were expressed in the messages, they just erase, they just collapse, and still the global harmony is built by the relation between the new and the old. So moving between memory and oblivion is exactly our way of building landscape. And the interesting thing is that when we really start to think about this amongst the processes of anthropic signalization, we can understand it clearly. Okay, there is a relation. We refute that, or we celebrate that, or we move space of oblivion to bring back something that was deliberately forgotten in a certain time. So we have this kind of game of putting one layer over the other or submitting it to a new, very pragmatic force. And we can understand that. But the interesting thing is that we can understand it also when we start to think about layerings and of imprintings that come from geological time. So if we really think about landscape of something that has to do with processes, not only anthropic signalizations, but processes that actually create form, create image, create signs. First, geological processes that create the first imprintings of a primordial landscape. Then the erosional process, anthropic processes that shape out this first primordial landscape and create the conditions for the implantation of life. Then life forms that can colonize these eroded territories and create themselves their own set of marks, of imprintings. And then us. Obviously, this is a succession that we can follow up like a phytosociological succession. But then we can also understand that every one of these processes, they keep going on parallel. I mean, geological processes, they are still acting in this very moment. The Pangea is still moving. The tectonic plates are still working together. The eruptions, the volcanic eruptions are still going on. The sedimentation processes are still going on. Erosion processes are still going on. So it's like having many series of parallel processes that inscribe inscriptions, that sign out the territory, and all together, that's what we call landscape. This is an image from the caves of Chauvet in the French Alps. It's a cave that became very famous because it was the subject of a documentary by Werner Herzog called The Cave of the Lost Dreams. And I like to think about this as a fantastic example of continuity. Well, if it is true that the process of landscape building is a process where we can understand a series of overlappings, this means a series of ruptures or a series of contradictions or a series of processes that sometimes deny the past, sometimes confirm this past and celebrate it. So when we start to analyze landscape, we can understand like moments of coherence, moments of fragmentation, moments of hesitation about erasing or not that memories. And this cave has this fantastic history. What we see here are drawings made by men 40,000 years ago. And 40,000 years ago, these images started to be painted in a cave that worked continuously as a ritual sanctuary for 20,000 years. So for 20,000 years, a group of people, a culture, was celebrating something that we cannot understand now continuously during 20,000 years, which is extraordinary. Then another 20,000 years after a probably earthquake, this cave entrance was sealed by a movement, by a geological movement, and the cave was absolutely inaccessible for other 20,000 years. And these images, they were just congealed in time. So 2 moments of extraordinary continuity. But what is more extraordinary is that when we start to analyze each one of these drawings that seem composed in a total harmonic coherence, we start to understand that they correspond to moments of inscription totally different, sometimes separated for more than 1,000 years. So this means that this harmony, this cultural continuity, is not necessarily done by creating a wonderful work of art and then freezing it in time for a long time. No, it means precisely that culture coherence is able to create harmony during time. Things are being built And I think that this is very important to understand what landscape can really be. Well, what we really build, even if we don't, is precisely soil. Soil is a container of time, a container of history, is a container of ourselves. From the primordial image of this primitive landscape. This is lava from a very recent eruption in Catania, in Sicily. Well, erosion processes of erosion. This is Africa, is Angola. The signalization by plants. Here very clear because we understand that the signal, the shape that this tree is inscribing in the world is precisely by the competition of light. Under the shadow, the composition of plants is totally different, so we really understand the position, and it really signs out a mark. Then the relations between different constructions. I like a lot this image. This is in a work that we are doing between Namibia, Zambia, Botswana, and Angola in a great park for wild animals. And we started to study this territory precisely trying to understand by the shapes of the roads that were traced in the soil, what kind of animals were present. And after a few contacts with guys that were very experienced in this thing, we started really to read this design as a text, and to be able not only to understand what were the animals that were there, but how many animals were there, which is extraordinary. And we did it from a plane with guys that were teaching us, no, that's elephants. I said, well, is that elephant? No, no, that's not elephants, that's a car. And we really understood that all that landscape was built by signs that were merging anthropic signatures with totally wild animal signatures, which is another extraordinary thing about this frontier between the natural and the cultural, that probably we should look for it more in a time horizon than in a spatial line. And it can be so simple. They can tell us by these signs not only what animal it was, but what it was doing. These are signs in the mountains of Trentino in Italy. The first ones, these ones are hippopotamus. These are cows moving along the hills, and they shape these incredible lines along because they always move on this direction. So it's like an imprinting, like an extraordinary image. This is a political situation. This is the border between Namibia and Angola. It corresponds to different political conditions. And this is the most beautiful bicycle lane in the world. Dynamics. Well, dynamics have also a lot to do with prejudice. When we think and when we ask an audition, we have this nostalgic idea that everything was much better in the past, where it was not. Things are quite good now. And these are fantastic images. The first images are from a set of photographs made by the famous geographer called Orlando Ribeiro, an extraordinary man that was studying Portugal and the geography generally of the Mediterranean in the 30s, 40s of the 20th century. And he was photographing a lot the country. And Duarte Belo, a very famous contemporary photographer, decided to take the Orlando Ribeiro photographs from the 30s and to go exactly to the same places and to select exactly the same lenses to be able to photograph the same landscapes. And the surprise was that we saw so many trees and so much more vegetation. So this idea that the development of time and the contact of man with this landscape is expressed by a tree cutting tendation. It's not really true, because here we can see that in the 30s, people were not starving, but almost, and they would depend on the use of animals to survive. So everybody had sheep and goats and cows, and if everybody has sheep and goats and cows, we don't have trees. We don't have nothing, which was exactly what was happening. We just had olive trees. Obviously, when people start to work, not depending from the animals that they have, vegetation starts to overlap the successions that were not enable any kind of vegetation from herbaceous stratus to be able to be seen. And it happened in all the situations that were photographed. Obviously, the other point is that we didn't have so many forest fires in the 30s as we have now, exactly by the same reason, because the forests are now converted into bombs that can explode at any minute, because sheep and cows and goats don't go there to eat. Dynamics again, this is the Elbe River, and this is the Elbe River. And this is the Mississippi. And each one of the positions of the Mississippi floodplain is in different colors. And the funny thing is that we really don't need to make a cartography to understand that as a process. Other dynamics are obviously the year-long cycle. This takes us to an understanding that time is actually fundamental in the landscape thinking, and that impermanence, instability, and transience are the values that we have to deal with at any moment. We do not work with a condition that is totally stable, or almost, as we do in architecture. And I think that this is like a methodological condition. It is very common to hear that architecture works with mineral materials, and that landscape works with living materials. It's not really like that. I think that architecture works with a different kind of time conception. It works with the juxtaposing of eternity with the ephemerity of our lives. And I think that this is the fundamental idea of architecture. And I think that we do exactly the same thing. We juxtapose time lives, different time lives. But we work with many different things, not just with this very egocentric consideration of the relation between us and the celebration of ourselves. We work with other things in between. So this takes us to a condition of understanding time as a process. This is a work by Irina Werning. It's a very however, we try to understand that this is not true, and even when we look at those photographs, we always try to deny what really happens in landscape. One of the things that take us to work in a different scale of time is obviously the fact that when we work with stones, we work with stable processes. When we work with trees or with other kinds of plants, we work with another strategy. Rocks don't really have another strategy apart from the thermodynamical condition that they will become sand. Cells, they have a very strong strategy to be able to shape energy and to be able to survive to entropy increasing. So Another thing, okay, we can describe landscape as this overlapping of signs that are due to processes that we can understand as natural processes like geological and erosion processes, phytosociological successions, zoological processes, or anthropological imprintings. And we can describe each one of these processes with a very sharp and objective way of reading them. And we take all the knowledges that we have at our services to do that. We take paleontology, we take geology, we take geomorphology, we take anthropology, we take history, we take archaeology, we take botanical and zoology and pedology and all those things, and we can actually describe very precisely landscape processes. However, we do not describe landscape, because landscape is that and also our interpretation of that. So this means that it has an objective life and a subjective life together. And what is interesting is that we were talking in the beginning of the need of having a concept that can be useful as a Swiss canivet, a Swiss knife, could be useful to work with it, no? Could be useful to help us in projects. Okay, so it is easy to understand that if this is true, and if landscape is both things at the time, then we have two Swiss knives. We have one which is working physically and materically with landscape. We have another which is working with perception and culture and with values. I tell you an example. In the 70s, in the year of 74, in Italy, one of the last campaigns of draining territories to make them become agricultural land was still happening in the surroundings of Venice, in Caorle. 74. People were getting a fantastic wetland area and draining it to make food, to make productive soils. And this was an idea that was coherently used since the Roman times. It was like that. That was a wetland full with mosquitoes and malaria and disease and not productive. And just by draining it, we could bring fantastic soil where we could make bread and pasta and fantastic things. So it was like that. Well, now values are totally different. Nothing changed in those landscapes except the values of things, the cultural values of things. Now, if anyone tries to drain a wetland, they put him in the hospital immediately. So it's total change. Okay. Well, the idea of continuity, which is actually a value, and it is a value that, as we have actually from Roman times, where we had a very difficult time on enhancing a continuous line of civility across the natural context by doing the Roman roads that were very, very hard to maintain. To the opposite, now it's very hard to keep a continuity of something that has to do with trees in the middle of a compact system of anthropic landscape. So continuity is a value, and continuity is an extraordinary and important tool to describe landscape in space as in time. So these connections of time that actually build as a palimpsest. This is in the Sé de Lisboa, the main cathedral of Lisbon, where in the cloister an archaeological excavation was able to discover 4 overlapping cities. What I think is important is the system of values that these ideas bring to our attitude as landscape architects. First, the idea that if it is true that we are in the middle of an incredible system of inscriptions that cover the world, that are due to an incredible set of different processes, then it is true that what we do is just a tiny little thing in the middle of an incredible, fantastic, strong process. So it immediately gets us humbles. What we do is to move between the joints of all these things and to try to apply and to be able to read them and to make them work in what we are trying to do, in the direction that we are trying to work with. On the other hand, it is true that if it is a system, then it is an operative system, and the changes that we do, even if they are punctual and very objectual, then they have consequences in all the system. So at the same time, it gives us a certain humble condition of reducing the ideas that we can be the protagonists of changing the world in our times, but at the same moment, the enormous responsibility of understanding that a small change can have enormous consequences. And this is very important, I think, in terms of method and in terms of attitude. Mainly because if this is true in terms of space, where we can actually understand, it is also true in terms of time, where we can only recognize our position as a joint between the past and the future, a past that we can recognize with studies and with the understanding of the other layers beneath us, and the future that we can only understand with ethics and with 3 or 4 values that we try to defend. Well, this takes us to this consideration that I will make it very brief, and showing this example. I think that this frontier is not interesting. Where nature ends and culture begins, it's like an obsessive thought to try to look for it. We are half natural and half cultural. This frontier cuts us in middle. What is the position of this frontier in ourselves? What is the natural part and the cultural part of ourselves? This is a tree that was opening a big hole in the 1940s in Lisbon, in a Lisbon park, and the manager of the park decided to close the wall with a wall of bricks. So 60 years or 70 years passed, and the tree kept growing, of course. So it involved the brick wall, and it created a strange thing, a monster or a beauty, but something where you cannot really tell where the wall finishes and the tree begins. However, time is, I believe, one of the major reading keys of landscape, and I would like to read the following projects, precisely using time as a description key, and showing how it is possible to consider time in so many different ways when we start to work in a very conscious time with it. Architecture works with a single reference point as it corresponds to an accumulation of energy in a building. A building is like a battery, you know, it takes energy, building energy. A brick is an amount of energy, then we put another one and another one. And at a certain moment, this accumulation of energy is at the top, at the maximum. And afterwards, we just can expect that entropy rises and energy goes down. And it's an aging process. The building will age, and the building will go down, and it will become sand. It's just a matter of time. Of course, we can input energy at other moments and put that line up again in maintenance processes or restoration processes, but that's all we can do. It's to postpone the death. Well, trees have a totally different curve as they move from conditions that become stable, and they are all asymptotical curves, which is really funny because as we work with different sets of plants in our parks, we, in the first moments, of the plantation have a certain instability, as some plants grow fast, but then they become smaller than the others that grow very slow. So it's like adolescence, no, with all the problems, but it's a very unstable thing. Then it becomes more stable, and then it becomes mature with the spatial relations very, very steady. This is important because, on the contrary of this, in which we have only one reference projectual moment, and this is what we design, this moment, here, if we have actually to have, if we want actually to have any control in terms of project, then we have to design and to think about many different moments of time, because the agents that will build spatially our architecture are totally different here from here. Obviously, we cannot talk about trees as the spatial protagonists of the architecture that we are building in the 3 first years of planting, because they don't exist. We work with topography, we work with building elements, but obviously we cannot think about building elements and topography after 25 years when trees become big as incredible cylinders with 50 meters high. Those are the protagonists of those moments. So this means that another methodological identity is the one that we have several reference moments, and if we want to have a good control in terms of project, if we really want to project, then we have to refer to many different moments of time. Well, but it's okay then. So showing the projects, I will start with this one. This is Lisbon, most beautiful city in the world. And this is the expo site. It was an exhibition, one of those expos. This was done in 1998, and we were involved in the construction of this park. I'm sorry. And the park was built upon this land, and it was agricultural land in the 60s. Here we see an affluent of the river. This is the River Tejo, and we see this as a photograph of the site in the 60s. And we see that we have a line here that changes completely the vocabulary of landscape. Here we have problems of drainage, and we have to drain out the water in order to make it productive. Then we have some remaining sites where we have wetland vegetation. How do you call it? Sepal wetland vegetation. Marshland. And from this frontier up, we have a totally different set of signs. We have other cultures, we have other size of parcels. So this is precisely a drainage program, and this is probably a big cereal cultivation. And 15 years later, this is in the 80s, we have a total change, almost a total change. We have here the limit that I was telling you about, but these agriculture signs, they were replaced by other functions. Here we have a landfill that worked as the Lisbon landfill for many years. Lixo makes a garbage landfill, wasteland. We have water treatment plant. So we have all the stinkies here. This was a military camp. We had a war going on in Africa that was ended by '74, and we have here some material that was there. And again, 20 years later, this is 97 probably, we have a totally renew of this landscape, and we have another portrait of the society that was inscribing these signs. And this is interesting, because if it is true that landscape is the result of the inscription of our lives, our gestures, our steps, our footsteps, our wishes, our dreams, the things that we really want to materialize in each generation, this means that it works exactly as a portrait of that society, of that community. And by reading landscape, we can understand who were those guys, what were they doing, what were their values, what were they, for instance, here we can see the triumph of the road system, and it corresponds exactly to the death of the railway system in Portugal, and it was precisely here, and it is really as a portrait. Sometimes it's like a Dorian Gray portrait, when nobody wants, do you recognize yourself in this lab? No, no, not me, but it really shows what we were doing. So in 30 years, landscape was written over and over again. And this park that we were designing over a plan that won a competition that we did together with the Hargreaves Associates was quite a headache, because the plan was a very formalistic kind of approach to this site. And I was really, when I then won the project competition, I was trying to get some logic in the formal approach, and I was going to try to justify the forms. Because one of the things that I think is important in those projects is that I believe that image is something that is not justifiable by its own. It has to correspond to a process. If landscape is actually a process, then image, landscape image, has to correspond to a process. It's the manifestation of a process. So it's not a design, it's not really a drawing that we can implant. It's something that has to emerge from a functioning metabolism. And that's a bit what we were trying to do here. And the idea was to create this system, a topographic system, that was mainly due to the necessity of organizing the views on the park. But then, because of the relations that we were organizing, these landforms were perpendicular to the river. And there was a very good argument there, because north is on that side and south is on that side. So we have sun on the south. And this means that if the landforms, which were like waves or half mustaches, if they were shaped like that, then they were showing one side directly to the sun and one side directly to the shade, to the north and to the winds. So this means that we could juxtapose two very, very different environments, and that we could, with the right amount of radicalism, by adding different soil, different irrigation system, and different plant composition, we could have a situation where time was not an agent of erosion and entropy, but was a builder of our science. So it was something that we could design, not really as a shape, not really as a form, but as a change of condition that would develop a form, that would develop the different conditions where we could bet that the more time passes, the more difference becomes the side, north side and the south side. I'm sorry, I have a rusty English, and sometimes it's difficult to get very clear. If I'm not clear, please let me know. So the idea was to create a system, create a functioning, create a metabolic functioning that would add difference. And by adding difference, it would become a builder of our design. So time was not something that we had to fight against with maintenance. Time was something that was actually helping us to inscribe our science. This is the... Well, another thing about the park was that actually it was precisely the first moment where this idea of palimpsest was clear in terms of design and of showing it through design. By shaping a very clear and sharp edge, that would become a clear frontier between the layer, the pre-existent layer of marsh vegetation, and the new set of programs that correspond to the new layer of construction. This is the same place in an 8-year distance. It became quite a popular park. And it had some nice features in terms of detail. I mean, drainage is done outside the path system. Water flows from these little holes in the limit, and then it is drained here, because traditionally we have drainage operating inside the size of our paths, but then again in this situation we thought that it would be just a loss of space, and we tried to reduce the dimension of the paths to a minimum, so putting everything that was infrastructural outside this area. Okay. Moving over, this is Italy, and it is a mining. This is one of the lost competitions that we were seeing there. I think this is very clear in terms also of what we can do. This is Torino, I'm sorry, and this is an asbesto mining site that they wanted to convert into some kind of a minerary museum. So it was supposed to be visitable. And as you know, asbestos is not a really good thing to touch or to inhalate. So we had to protect people, and we had to allow a way of moving across this thing without really being in direct contact with the rocks. And the funny thing is that when we look at it, we see a first set of signs that correspond to the geological foundation of this landscape. Then we see that vegetation signs, other sets of signs, like a new vocabulary. And then we see that the mining system inscribes a geometry that has nothing to do with the geometry that was revealed by the first relations. So we thought that what we could do was precisely to work in a new set of signs that would correspond to a new geometry that would be totally recognizable. So as if the different times of this landscape could be totally independent, like if they had no contact, which actually happened with the mining system. It was just something that was digged, creating no relation with the landscape that was around. And the same thing we did by inscribing these big corridors where people could move protected in a system that can be described like this, from something that just protects people from falling rocks and from touching or inhaling the asbestos, to something that if we protect the rock with resin, in some moments just to see it, then we have a shape that together is the protective idea of the home, of the protective space for man. And then we create these corridors that are like this and that work like this in landscape, creating the possibility of, well, understanding what we are saying and moving on that. But the interesting thing is that here, times are not merging. They are actually detached. They are totally detached. They don't touch. They just touch physically. And then we move on one time, looking and not touching the other times, okay? So it's like an overlapping of totally independent times. This is another project. This is Portugal. It's an octagon. It's a Roman structure, they say. It's a Roman fortification. So it's something that corresponded to a very clear function 2,000 years ago. And then it only survived because it had a certain physical resistance. And it's fantastic how it resisted with some openings and some cuts, some parts that were totally destroyed or were never built, because in this side there was a river where we did this park, and this river was like a marsh again, so probably it was not needed to build a military protection on that side. Or probably it was there and it was flooded away by certain moments of the river. We don't know. But what is extraordinary was that in the middle of those changing processes in 2,000 years of history, this octagon was there, showing their incredible physical perfection. 220 meters of side. And in a certain moment of Portuguese history, this is the complex of parks that we were building. This was part of a very big project that we were doing with a Portuguese architect called Gonçalo Byrne, who was working in another set of things, and we had these 3 parks, practically. This was the water dam park, this was a fair park, and this was a system that we were trying to create as a link between the old system and our system of parks. So the structure had a function now, it could have a function, it could become the part of a set of greenways. This is a moment, a sad moment, where the structure was taken as the national symbol. You know that nationalist governments, they all need these strong symbols of heroism and strength. Well, in the 40s, this octagon was taken to the totally invented condition of being the headquarters of the Portuguese resistance to the Roman invasion. And it was not true, obviously, because the people that were living in the peninsula were not able to shape such a geometry with such a sharp precision. However, they did it. They called it the Cava de Viriato. Viriato was this hero that was resisting, like Asterix, to the invader. And this was precisely the idea of Asterix, no? The village that was resisting, the only village that was resisting to the invasion. Well, but the damaging part was that they decided to make a garden at the top of that. So instead of showing a clear shape, earth construction that it actually was at the beginning, what we found out was something like that, with little benches and little hedges and a tree plantation that was, well, not really in good shape. And it was really hard to understand what we could do. And this is how it was. And suddenly I had this image, you know, in the shower, we have these flashes, and I just remembered one very interesting moment. When I was a little kid, like in 4th grade, I had this teacher who was the director of the school, and he used to threaten us with a ruler, a wooden ruler, and he usually also was beating us with that. Those times were different. And when he wanted to silence us, he would bang that thing on the table and saying, "Silence, silence." And the ruler was totally deformed by this kind of uses. And in one fantastic day, I get to my place, which was just in front, and aside of that ruler, that was completely useful for unuseful for geometric because it was all rotten, there was a fantastic steel ruler at the side. And when I was showering, I had this same image of the two things side by side. I said, yeah, well, that's exactly what we do. We need a ruler. We need a steel ruler. We need something that is able to create the abstract condition of celebrating the geometry only by just opposing another time to the time that was the time of the structure. We actually don't know how the structure was, what it was. We just know what it is. And we just can understand the relation between this structure and the incredible perfection of the geometry that it was approaching, nothing else. So we wanted to create the possibility of measuring it with footsteps, but also with meters, to show the precision of the angles, to show the breaking continuity. Even to replace it, but it didn't exist anymore. So, just opposing times, but here, creating a relation, creating actually a relation that was enabling us to make them work together as one single thing. This is another idea about time. This is a competition that was won in 2006 for the city of Antwerp. And it was a master plan for the waterfront in about 7 kilometers of extension in this condition. Well, the problem was that the city was trying to understand how to design an infrastructure that would protect the city from the rising of the river scalar. Okay? So the river was rising not from a hydrological condition that would be easily solved with retention basins and strategies like that. It was actually rising by the rising of the sea. The common manifestation of low pressures, winds that flow from a certain direction, everything, it would rise this. And it would flood the city, and we could do nothing but to create this kind of frontiers. That's right now a concrete wall of 1.20 meters high with gates. And when they predict that there is going to be a flood, well, they just announce it in the streets, and people get down in their pajamas and they get the cars, or otherwise they will just see the car float away. So it's a process they were trying to avoid, and they were also trying to enhance the condition of protection. Right now, with this height, they have a protection of about 25 years, a return period of 25 years, which is not too much, and they wanted to make big investments like underground parkings and things like that, so they needed a bigger protection. So they wanted to rise the return period to something about 300 years, and this meant to rise the height of the wall to 2.40 meters. And thank God they understood that that was a problem, because they would build a wall between the city and the river. So they launched this competition to understand what they could do. Here it is, the wall, the gates. The extraordinary thing is that this condition of separating a floodable part of the city and a non-floodable part of the city was already creating a character distinction between the two parts. In one, we had normal city with a normal kind of equipment, and on the other side, we had like a terrain vague, like open land, an open site where the port was no longer very active, but where nothing was really moving on in a definite way. Everything was temporary, because obviously it would flood. And this was a character that we were trying to keep. People use this for strange manifestations, or just to walk, parking, to eat lunch, but it is a marginal situation. Well, we try to analyze this in many different ways. But the interesting thing that I consider fundamental for winning the competition and for this link between this idea and the idea of time is that at a certain moment we understood that it was not possible to propose design as if it was a building, because we were talking about 8 kilometers of city with many different actors, with many different problems. So how could we approach this system with a design, with something that would freeze this condition? It was impossible. So we had to put on a possibility of creating a dynamic process, or to allow a dynamic process. But we didn't have the tools, because urbanistic tools only enable us to recognize a validation condition, like a time limit for the action of a plan. But it was difficult to incorporate indeterminism, to incorporate hesitation, to incorporate uncertainty. And we decided to understand this problem working with sections, of course. Well, the first consideration was, well, thank God there are more than a wall to solve the problem of the city protection. For instance, if we do a topographic change, instead of building a wall, we are able to protect the city and still to create a condition that is probably more permeable now than it is now, because we were only shaping land, only shaping landscape, only shaping topography, rising to a moment, to a level that would allow the city to be protected. But what we would create would be a new landscape. So let's avoid the wall and let's just work with topography or other means. Working with topography, we can consider a set of sections that correspond to a situation where we put the protection point near to the city and far from the river, maximizing the surface of land that is still floodable, partially floodable. Another way of solving things is with floatable structures. And we have in Holland these two, and we design another one. And this is important because this means that we could keep a coherent, protective situation until the edge of the water. And this was good when we have like an historical center where we really need a very strong connection between the river and the city. And then we have other sections, but we found out that these 10 sections that we study deeply in terms of functioning with different levels of water, programmatic possibilities, these 10 sections were everything that we needed to solve this problem. So we just needed to place them in this 8-kilometer-long riverfront. And if there were situations where we were very able to immediately say, this is the solution, this is the section that we want to apply, there were others where we had to hesitate. So this means that this master plan toolkit is not really a closed master plan, but it is not really not deciding, because we are deciding, we are not deciding between these three, but we are saying that one of these three should be applied. We are not deciding between these four or between these two, but we are not opening to an infinite way of possibilities. We are limiting possibilities and trying to create another idea inside planning time to make other actors or more information to work out in order to enable us to understand what really we can do and to really choose between one of these. So in the ones that we could work immediately, we immediately passed from master plan to project level. In the others, we would wait. This idea of bringing the dynamic idea into planning procedures enable us also to create a model, this keyboard, where we actually were dealing with the attribution of a certain measure to these abstract sections in order to create a model where we could predict the functioning of the barrier, but we could also predict costs, for instance. And we could also, in these sections, start to see if the design conditions that we were placing in the definitions of the plan could really work in order to create a project possibility. This other project works directly with the idea of palimpsest. This is a work that is still in progress, that was developed with a friend and colleague, Gomes da Silva, who we worked together in many other projects. And this is Lisbon, the most beautiful city in the world. And this is the very center of Lisbon. This is Praça do Comércio. You know, Lisbon was under a very, very severe earthquake in 1755. And the city was totally destroyed and was rebuilt again. And we lost practically 90% of our population on that day. And this that you are seeing is precisely an image where you can see 3 or 2 moments of encounter between the new structure, where the city was rebuilt with a totally new order, and places where the city was rebuilt also, but over the signs of the city that was destroyed. And they are fantastic, again, the palimpsest idea. So the work is on this place, and we are just aside of the main plaza of Lisbon, a plaza that opens to the river, and in a very symbolic location. However, it was very, very marginalized, and nobody was really caring much about this place. Even if it had an incredible potential, the street was just passing, and this was just a leftover that was for many years under considered, except from lovers that would continually go there and, like these guys, just celebrate the river and the sun and their love and this incredible condition. Even if they have to be gifted with an incredible abstraction capacity, they would still go there. Showing the site a long time, we can see that it was a very stable kind of site. This is the design of the city before the earthquake, where you can see a totally different shape, a medieval shape, descending from an Arabic design, urban design. Then you can see how it was organized. This was the King's Palace. This was the plaza that actually was replaced by this new plaza. This was the customs, where taxes were paid. This was the market, and this was where the ships were built, exactly where we were working. So this is like an organigram of the country. We built the ships to get products to sell here and to pay taxes here, and so it couldn't be more clear as. Well, the design was very, very clear also. This is still the King's Palace. This was the shape of the plaza that was called the Terreiro do Paço, so the plaza of the King's Palace, and then replaced by Praça do Comércio, the plaza of the commerce, and this means a totally change in what we consider important for the kingdom. But the shape of this site is, the shape of this site is always the same. Dock, a smaller dock, 2 launching ramps. So it's a building site, a shipbuilding site. After the rebuild of the city, as you can see, practically everything changed, except this. Again, this is a dock, another dock, 2 launching. So it is something that was very, very stable a long time. And it was stable because it was active. The changes have to do with changes in the functioning of shipbuilding. And as you can see, even when the city started to develop landfills occupying the river and creating quays, this site was always kept as the same. This is the second landfill of Lisbon in this site, always like that, because it was always working in maintenance of ships and working in the construction of ships. And it went there. Well, this is some iconography where we see always the reference to this condition of shipbuilding, a shipbuilding yard, more or less some images. We still have some photographs of what the site was in the beginning of the century. And it was a very active construction site with sailors, and this was King Dom Carlos and Rainha Dona Amélia. This is the launching of a big ship. The ramps, stone ramps with wooden structures. The dry dock, we're here with the ship in maintenance, the gates of the dock, the caldeira, okay. And suddenly, in the 50s, everything was destroyed to create this road that would allow a very impertinent way of getting inside the plaza, because we would not get from the earth side, but from the river side, reverting completely the scenographic idea of the plaza construction. And when we started to work here, our bet was that the guys that did this, they had no time and no work on destroying the foundation of the structures that they just covered with a layer of oblivion. So everything was there. So what we did was practically to rewrite the signs that were there, obviously with a different meaning, because we were not going to build ships. We were going to propose an open public space to the city where lovers could sit looking at the river. But we still needed the open dock in order to create a relation that would destroy the promiscuous continuity between this space and this one. We need detachment. We need to get loose from that thing. So we created the dock again. And we signed out with this limit where the ramps now are amphitheaters to look at the river, and the dry dock is archaeologically brought to contemporary. And we add this beach, and in the middle of the new shape of the coastline and the old shape of the coastline, we just put like an abstract mass of black stone where cars pass without really enhancing a geometry with the traffic. So this is like the components of the project. So this was something where we actually went to the layers that were beneath a layer of oblivion and bring them upon this to contemporary times. This is the beach construction. And here is the beach. It's an urban beach. This is the opening day. So the operation is a clear operation in this palimpsest idea, okay? Landscape is as free as this extraordinary universe of work that we can overlap and again change the order of things. But what is extraordinary is that this process that here was done with something that really existed, here we did it again in a valley that was a orchage, cultivation valley, but with a dimension that was also recreative. People would go here to have fresh, to have perfumes, to get away from the city and the heat of the city. So it is a place here that was always represented in iconography like some kind of arcade, you know, like a garden, a place where people would dance and have picnics. And the Valley of Alcântara, with all this symbolic charge, bucolic place, romantic site, where peasants were side by side with noble guys dressed very well. And this atmosphere resisted until the beginning of the 20th century. It was really a bucolical kind of image. And then suddenly, under the instructions of an extraordinary minister of the public works, Duarte Pacheco, a set of infrastructures were built, and the valley was drastically changed into an infrastructure. The river was in-tubed, in an incredible engineering construction for that time. And over this tunnel, an avenue was built linking the port and the river with the new highway that was built between Lisbon and Cascais. And what is extraordinary was that this new image was replacing the old in iconography. Postcards were showing this image as the new modern Lisbon of the progress, which is an extraordinary adaptation capacity. In the 80s, in exactly this place, water treatment plant was built, but it was not really good. It did secondary treatment. So now in the 2000 years, a new competition was moved to improve the level of treatment and to create practically a new treatment system that would produce drinkable water. And the water that you saw in the beach, the urban beach, was the quality of water that we get after this treatment plant was created. So it's quite good water. And Well, of course, such an operation would correspond to the building of an incredible building, and a real building, because it had to be closed because of smells. And this is the shape of the new building that would be done. And this is normal quarteirão, block of Lisbon, thank you. So we are talking about a building of 5 blocks, which is terrible when you look at it as a building, but not so terrible when you look at it as a topography. Actually, the first treatment plant cut an extraordinary important part of the topography of the valley, and this building was the possibility of doing like a prosthetic approach to topography. And it was exactly what we did with the architects Manuel Mateus and Frederico Valsacina. We developed this shape, trying to create precisely an idea of topography. And a topography where we built a relation that was exactly the relation that the old agricultural farmers would do. We would create terraces with imported soil, artificial soil, transported from sites where the soil existed to this site where the soil didn't exist, only moved by 2 parameters: the steepness of the terrace and the limit for a height of the wall between terraces. And doing that, we created a landscape that not only showed the topography as a pixel system, because obviously the steepness was conditioning the dimension of each terrace, but it was also enabling us to make literally the building disappear by creating an overlapping of a system that is a reference to a time that actually never existed. It was just an image, just a memory, just in our imaginary. So working in landscape is, and if we have here some students of landscape architecture, this is probably the most extraordinary profession in the world, because the degree of freedom is so good. The possibilities are so incredibly high. And the possibility of creating landscape by the image of the memories of landscape, or archaeological layers, or anything else that can take us through a project and through an idea, is really an extraordinary and a fantastic experience. Thank you to all. Thank you so much for your attention.